I have a number of children in my life. I have my nieces, and I have my grandsons, and of course other children. And I love spending time with children. One of the things that I love the most is telling cheesy jokes, because kids seem to appreciate my humor far more than adults in my life. And sometimes the kids in my life, my nieces, will ask me questions, and I'll give them a silly response, and they will giggle, and they'll say, "No, Uncle Tim, no, no." Once I told them that I had invented their Nintendo Switch. That's their favorite game, is Nintendo Switch. And I told them, I invented Nintendo Switch. "No, you didn't, Uncle Tim. If you invented Nintendo Switch, how come you don't have a whole lot of money then?" Touche, touche, touche. And it's a silly game that we play together anytime we're around, the old dad joke kind of a thing, And my nieces and my grandsons, they pretty well have figured out that anytime my lips are moving, I'm probably being silly. But not all the time, not all the time. Because sometimes I do share with them factual information. One time we were at a game at State Farm Stadium, not too far away here, and I told my nieces that the playing field, the grass playing field, slides out on a track into the parking lot so that the grass can get sunshine and grow. And that, if you're familiar with State Farm Stadium, is completely true. And yet, to these little girls, that seemed completely absurd. And it seemed like it must be just another one of my silly exaggerations to make them laugh. And one time, we were in Hawaii together, and I told them that the name of the state fish of Hawaii is the humu nuku nuku apua'a, which it is. But they thought that I was just making up a silly sounding word to make them laugh. The humu nuku nuku apua'a is, in fact, the state fish of Hawaii.
Never heard that.
And my grandson likes to say I'm joking him. That's his word, joking. "Why you always joking me, Noni?" That's what he asks me. And why would these kids just simply assume that any time I'm speaking that I'm joking them? Why would I joke them? Why would they not believe me, even though I'm telling them things that might be truthful and they sound absurd to them? And the answer is it's because they're skeptical, and rightly so. Rightly so. I haven't given them much reason to believe that those things could possibly be true. So today, in our gospel story, we hear about our buddy Thomas, who's probably the most well-known skeptic of all human history. We even have a nickname that we call skeptics. When they don't believe something we tell them, we call them doubting Thomases. But here's the thing. It's probably not a good idea to dump on Thomas too much for wanting to see and feel evidence of the resurrection of Jesus. There are some things that we can learn from this story, and one of those things is that maybe, just maybe, it can be good to doubt things. It can be healthy to be a skeptic and to cross-check our sources before we decide to accept something that someone tells us. Now, for centuries, Christians have shamed other Christians while using this passage. Because Jesus says, "Blessed are they who have believed and have not seen." And depending on the inflection that Jesus was using in his voice, which is something we simply don't have access to, we don't have that inflection, right? It's possible that Jesus could have been shaming Thomas. Or, and hear me out here, he could have simply been adding an anecdote that would be useful for the rest of us to hear. Because Jesus didn't abandon Thomas for his doubting. He welcomed him. And I can't imagine Jesus to be terribly passive-aggressive. Right? If we think of it that way, I could picture somebody walking around the streets of New York City, saying, "You want to touch my wounds? Here, touch them. Touch these wounds. There. Now you happy? Now you happy?" In the Bronx, maybe, right? But instead, I read it in a way that suggested that if Thomas needed a little more information, then Jesus was willing to offer that extra information. Because to me, that sounds much more like a loving, Jesus-like response to meet Thomas where he was and to be understanding of why he might be doubting. Nobody has ever seen this happen before. Why would he just have to believe that this is what had taken place? And why should Thomas have taken the other apostles' word for it? Because they were there and he wasn't there. They had already had their chance to see the resurrected Jesus. But Thomas wasn't there. So why should he have some arbitrary burden of expectation placed on him that the others didn't have placed on them? Now, knowing full well that Thomas hadn't been there the first time around, Jesus extends to him the same courtesy that he would have had with the other apostles during the previous encounter. Now, within Christianity, there are some sects that demand absolute acceptance of dogma and doctrine. And if you don't believe this teaching, then you're not one of us. But that isn't exactly healthy faith. That's kind of cult mentality. Because only cults have hard and fast rules that the members must follow in order to avoid being exiled away. And we're not in a cult. We're followers of Jesus. And we're held to a standard of loving one another. But we aren't bound to believe things that we find to be problematic. And if we're honest with ourselves, can any of us honestly say with 100% certainty that we have always absolutely believed everything about Christianity every single day of our entire lives? Can we honestly say we've never wondered, we've never pondered, we've never thought about what it might be like after we die? Can we honestly say that we've always believed absolutely everything in the creeds, every waking minute of every day since we learned them? And if you can say that, well, then I think that's great. I'm happy for you. But if you're like me and you've wrestled with pieces of our faith, then I suspect we are in pretty good company. In fact, I sincerely hope that each of us takes time to examine our faith and that we question things that we've been taught and that we're supposed to believe. You see, faith is not a quiz or a test, and we're not going to be graded for how faithful we are and how strictly we adhere to our teachings. We don't win a prize for having perfect faith, and we don't earn more, Jesus points because we've believed everything everywhere all at once. When we die, do we honestly think that Jesus is going to be sitting there with a clipboard, interviewing us, saying, "Well, I see that you had trouble believing this." Do we believe that that's what Jesus is going to be doing? I mean, I guess if we do believe that, there isn't anything inherently wrong with that belief, but I just personally don't think that that's terribly likely. You see, God understands our human brains. And how do I know that? Well, God created those brains. He knows how our brains work. He knows how we think. He knows how we reason. And it's really not reasonable to believe something without evidence. Now, people often mistakenly believe that doubt is the opposite of faith, but that's not the case. The opposite of faith is certainty. Because if we're certain about something, we don't need to have faith in it. Now, what I'm promoting here is a healthy skepticism, right? Not a blind skepticism. I'm not suggesting we ought to go down the rabbit trail of conspiracy theories and things like that. I'm not saying, for instance, that we should doubt the efficacy of vaccines, because there's lots of evidence that shows the vaccines save lives. And there's lots of evidence suggesting that fluoride in our drinking water is perhaps the #1 health advancement of all human history. And doubting those things because we saw somebody share a YouTube video on Facebook, well, we probably don't want to do that. But doubting them because we haven't yet seen the evidence, well, then that's a different story. Once we have the evidence, we say, okay, got it, I'm good. There's no need to keep doubting after we've been shown the evidence. Now, my niece didn't believe me about State Farm Stadium because that claim just sounded completely absurd. Why would that even be a thing, to move the grass outside? Well, that sounds ridiculous. And it sounds mechanically difficult to figure out a way to make that happen. And it sounds strange, and it sounds foreign. She was right to be skeptical of that. But guess what? I was able to find a news report demonstrating the grass moving in and out of the stadium, right? And then I took her down to the lower level where the field was, and I showed her. See those there? Look like railroad tracks. There's tracks that take the grass out into the parking lot. And if you've seen them, then you know it looks like a railroad track that this grass slides along. Okay? And once she saw those things, she understood. She understood what I was talking about. But it wasn't silly for her to be skeptical when we're sitting up in the seats and I say, "You see that grass? It goes outside." I'm like, no, it doesn't. It doesn't. It's not silly for her to be skeptical of that. It's actually pretty wise. And it wasn't silly for Thomas to be skeptical of the resurrection of Jesus. It was wise. Now, it would have been silly for him to continue to doubt after he encountered Jesus, but it wasn't silly for him to be doubtful in the first place. The truth is, God's feelings aren't going to be hurt if we have our doubts. In fact, I'm hopeful that by hearing me say that, I can put some of us at ease by not worrying so much about any doubts that we might have. I used to feel tremendous shame for doubting anything that had to do anything with faith. And I used to feel tremendous shame for even having the shadow of a doubt. Questions like, is there really a God? Am I going to heaven? Is there a heaven? Is Jesus truly present in the sacrament of the Eucharist? Is Jesus really God? Now, those are all tenets of Christianity. Those are things that we as a Christian community believe. But it's perfectly healthy to have ponderings about them. Why? Well, because while we believe these things as Christians, we're not certain. We're not certain. None of us has met God face to face sitting at a table across from one another. And none of us has been to heaven, and none of us has seen any physical proof that Jesus is present in the sacrament, and none of us has seen the Trinity to know or to understand how that mystery of the Trinity functions. There are probably a lot of things that we as a worshiping community and as individuals get wrong. But we do have God's continual revelation that God continues to make to us, that help us to understand our faith more fully as we continue to work at it. So don't worry about skepticism in a healthy way. It's a good idea to be a skeptic. But don't keep doubting something after you get quality evidence. It's not a requirement to believe everything without at least examining it. And in fact, I encourage each of us to examine our faith frequently. If we imagine our faith as a big structure made of bricks, we want our faith to be strong enough that we can take out one of the bricks and examine it and decide if this piece of our faith still works for us. And it's quite possible that we might find another brick that might fit that hole a little better and make the faith foundation even stronger. And it's perfectly possible that as we continue to grow in faith, that maybe the brick we use to replace it, maybe we toss that one and replace it with something different. Maybe we swap out some of those pieces of our faith time and time again as we continue to learn and to grow in our lives of faith. Blessed are we who believe, even when we sometimes have difficulty in wrestling with our beliefs. Here's your permission to doubt and to doubt boldly. Amen.